My name is David Prescott. I am the host, the editor of Safer Society Press, who is hosting Alan Sroufe, who's with us right now. Alan Sroufe is the author of A Compelling Idea, How We Become the Persons That We Are. And it's, as he describes it, a book about a life, a career, and the history of an entire field. And so Dan Siegel said of your book, it's a magnificent combination of memoir and scientific autobiography. Alan, how did you come to write it? And welcome, by the way.
Well, thanks, David. I guess I had a couple of principal motives. First, this project that we worked on at Minnesota for decades led to lots of interesting findings and lots of lessons for practitioners. And we tried to write this up in numerous formats, but most of them were pretty technical. And even our book, The Development of the Person, was a little encumbered with facts and figures and so forth. So first of all, I wanted to write a book that made the story of what we found on this study really accessible to people. And I wanted to tell the whole story from the beginning up to now. That was one motive. And the other one was lots of times people have taken attachment theory to be a kind of pessimistic theory. That is the idea of that you have this attachment in infancy, and if you have an anxious attachment in infancy, then you're pretty much doomed. And we never thought that. We don't think our study ever possibly suggested that. We had just as much evidence regarding change as we did regarding stability and continuity. And we were just as interested in how did change happen as we were interested in the question, why does early experience matter? And so I wanted to really make that the central theme of this book. And we always have had case studies in our writing, and in this book, there's quite a bit of that. But when we're describing someone from our study, we of course have to conceal a lot of information about them. We have to disguise the story. We have to misdirect, and you just have to ethically. You cannot reveal the stories of these people in a way that you could actually identify them. And so I had thought all along that I could tell my story, and I could tell all the details of my story, and I have the right to do that. I didn't even have to ask for my own permission. I didn't sign anything. I just decided I could do that. And that actually made the book fun to write, because I could tell lots of anecdotes about the past, many of which I found amusing. And I could also reveal that I did not have a good childhood. There were lots of problems in my childhood. And that was a way of making it clear that I, for one, did not believe that if you had a difficult childhood, an anxious attachment or other problem, that meant you couldn't grow and change and develop and have a good life. And so I traced my story, including lots of the problems I had, not just as a child, but as a young adult, and lots of the struggles I had. And also discussed quite a bit about the relationship influences that helped me deal with those problems. So those were the reasons. It was actually a really fun book to write. And I heard a physicist, a guy named Leonard Susskind. He wrote a book called The Dark Hole Wars. And he's perhaps even a little older than I am, and he did it in an autobiographical way. He talked about his working class childhood. His dad was a plumber, and he talked about how he nonetheless managed to get an education. His dad had wanted him to follow in his footsteps, but ultimately accepted that it was okay if he were a world leading theoretical physicist, that would be okay too. And he said the same thing. And there's a great interview of him by Brian Greene. And when he's talking about his book, you could see he just loved writing it. And I felt the same way. I took a long time. I probably spent 7 or 8 years writing that book, even though it's a short book, because I thoroughly enjoyed it and worked on it until it said just what I wanted it to say.
Excellent. And one thing that I did notice about it, well, actually, the first thing that I'm going to say is if anybody has any questions and wants to either enter them into the chat or the Q&A or to raise your hand, you're certainly welcome to do so. By all means, participate. But what I was going to say is that you know, our marketing director at Safe for Society, Steve Zioli, and I have had conversations about the linear quality of biographies and autobiographies. One thing I appreciate about your book, A Compelling Idea, is how your story and the history of your field weave so nicely together. So that it does go back and forth and ends up being a much more readable book. Was that intentional in any way, or
Oh,
is that,
absolutely,
yeah,
100%. And it's actually, I mean, it's true from the word go that doing the work I was involved with and my life story are closely connected, because even as a child, I wanted to figure out why my parents had the problems they did, why I had the problems I did. I really wanted to understand that. I did a psychology major in college on purpose because I thought maybe that would help. And I started studying infant development because I thought it probably was the place to start. And when I encountered attachment theory, I knew I had found the place I wanted to go. I knew somehow the answers would be there. It did not take very long. I think by the time we were in the second year of this 40 plus year study, by the time we were in the second year of it, I knew the answers to my questions were there. Not that we had them yet. And that's the way I tried to write the book. I tried to write it about what was the first question, and then how did that lead to the next question, and then how did that lead us forward? Once we knew attachment predicted outcomes, wanted to know, well, why doesn't it always? And how do some of those kids change? And then how do attachment experiences work with later experiences? And those questions unfolded. It's always interesting to me, the graduate students that worked on this study, say they're at the Institute 4 or 5 years, there were always new questions that arose while they were students. And then there were new questions the next time too. So
excellent.
yeah, it was purposeful and easy to weave together my history and the history of this study. And the study actually is a part of the history of the field. I was trained as a behaviorist. Behaviorism ruled prior to attachment theory. Relationships were not studied much by psychologists prior to attachment theory. And at the same time, it seemed pretty obvious that relationships had to be important to how we become the people we do. So when attachment theory came along, it was really an opening.
Fantastic. And for folks that have just joined us, I'm speaking with Alan Sroufe, who's the author of this excellent book, A Compelling Idea. And please do feel free to ask any questions using the chat or the raise hand or Q&A features, anything that you would like. And Alan, I guess I was also wondering, what are some of the most important things that mothers and fathers and teachers should know?
Well, it starts with okay. Number one, even though attachment theory suggests that there's a hierarchy of attachment relationships, all of the close relationships children have are vitally important. even if a mother is a primary attachment figure, that does not lessen the importance of fathers or other partners. One of the things we found in our study early on and continued to find throughout the study was the social support system available to the parents was critical in supporting the unfolding of a secure attachment and subsequent development. So in the case, for example, of infants who were anxiously attached, but somehow overcame that history and became well-functioning, let's say, preschool children, when you looked at what were the factors that influenced that, you always found things like social support. Many of the mothers in our study were single, unmarried mothers when the child was born. Forming a stable partnership always was an important factor in explaining positive change in the children. And that's completely understandable. Being a parent raising a child in poverty on your own with few resources is a tough job. When the resources become more available, and those are usually relationship resources, then things can go better. And indeed, we saw that over and over. So not only are both parents important, so are other relationships. We had opportunity to work with preschool teachers quite a bit. We had our own nursery school. We had 2 nursery school classes, one each semester, 1 year. And we also spent quite a bit of time in schools. And lots of times people who work with children get quite discouraged. I remember our preschool teachers thinking, gosh, it was going so well during the week, and then the weekend came, and on Monday he was just as troubled, or she was just as troubled as she'd always been. It's like what I did was just washed out. And I know for a fact that is not true. When we study the process of change, we know that the islands of security and safety that an adult is providing for a child can be helpful later, even if you can't see it now. That was the first time I became impressed with educators, because we got to see close up how much they cared about the kids, how difficult their task was, and how important they were to children. We actually once, when the participants were 19 years old, couldn't call them children anymore at that age. When they were 19, we asked them, did you ever have a teacher that you knew was really on your side, that you knew really cared about you and was there for you? Do you ever have a special teacher like that? And those kids who were doing well could name a teacher like that. And actually, the children with secure attachment histories more often named a teacher like that. So that's just one example of where you have a positive, secure relationship with a parent. That opens the door for you to have a positive relationship with a teacher. And that prepares you for next relationships. We saw the same thing with regard to therapy. Sometimes therapists think, boy, I worked with this kid 2 years and they're still struggling. Just know it's important what you're doing. Any safety you provide for a child, it's important.
Excellent. As a former therapist, I am very relieved to hear that, having had many of those kids. As you're speaking, I guess I wonder if you have anything else to say. It's maybe a little bit out of left field. I have heard a lot of people and interviewed a lot of people who said, my life really turned around when I was in juvenile detention and I made a relationship with the cook, and the cook took me under his wing, or I had that one special teacher, et cetera. Did this, how much did that turn up in your research?
Yeah. Primarily, we can only answer that anecdotally because that's a very difficult thing to study systematically with the kind of study we were doing. So we were following these children over time. We didn't select them because they were all children that had a mentor or something. But over and over, I remember one kid in particular that I liked a great deal, probably because he was a hyper kid like I was. And neither of his parents, well, his father was gone and his mother wasn't very competent, but he had an uncle and he knew that uncle cared about him. And there was another child in our study that lost both of his parents, and his grandparents took over and they helped him. And I can think of another girl who was her grandmother. Her mother was in jail off and on, and it was her grandmother that was the steady, stable force. And in fact, sometimes in our study, those were the people we brought in to assess with the child because they were the primary person for the child. So I have no doubt those relationships are important. And I know there are people that study them systematically. You'd need a different kind of study than ours to do that. But I certainly was impressed with that.
Nice.
And I know it from my own life too. I remember a third grade teacher who I was kind of facile with doing multiplications problems and stuff. And she would give me challenging ones and be very supportive. And that made a huge difference in my whole life. That year, I found out, well, I don't feel so good about one thing or another, but I feel pretty good about how I'm doing at school here. And I had a number of teachers that were very positive and supportive of me. I had one teacher, my mother wound up being a sales clerk in a Sears store. And I had one teacher who for years would go into Sears to ask my mother how I was doing. And that's, that seems like a really small thing, but note, I remember that. I know that still decades and decades later. And all it was, she went in and asked my mother how I was doing. And what does that convey to a child? This person really cares about you, is pulling for you. And that's what we all need. So it's an interesting thing to be interested in, David. It's a good thing to pursue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know this is a question that you get asked from time to time, so it seems a good place to ask it, which is within all of your research, where does temperament fit into all of this?
Well, it fits in several places. I mean, the study of temperament's a whole huge field. And it was going on long before we started our study, and it's still going on. Lots of people are studying temperament. And there's no question that temperament is an important thing to study and has an important influence on development. It's kind of not the same kind of thing we were studying. First of all, that's the first thing I'll say. When you're studying attachment, what you're trying to understand is how confident is this child that this caregiver is available and will be responsive to them. It's confidence in the responsivity that you can get from the environment. So you can imagine a whole range of temperaments, kids with vastly different temperaments may or may not be confident that the parent will respond to them. And in fact, the research has shown pretty well that temperament and attachment are, the technical word is orthogonal. That means they don't relate very much. So you can have kids with a easy to arouse temperament or a slow to arouse temperament, or hyperactive kids and low active kids. And they can be secure or not. Secure kids come in all stripes of temperament, and anxious kids come in all stripes of temperament. Now, but that's not the question most people are interested in. People are more interested in, well, the first question we can set aside, and everybody I think can agree on this, which is temperament does not determine your attachment. But is temperament nonetheless important, whether you're securely attached or not? And if so, how is it important? And clearly, what temperament does is set the parameters for what different children need. It's the same thing that people would talk about who talk about individualized learning. If a child is very easily distracted and has great difficulties focusing, you need to provide different supports for that child if you're a teacher or a parent than for a child who's very hard to get perked up and interested in stuff. You approach those situations differently. In the attachment field, the main way we saw this was in terms of defining parental sensitivity. And what sensitivity means in the attachment field is not how thin-skinned you are. Sensitivity means, are you sensitive and attuned to this child? So you can see pretty quickly, being sensitive to one child requires different things than being sensitive to a different child. So if you have two children with very different reactivity levels, they're going to need you to behave in different ways in order for them to be emotionally regulated properly and to be securely attached to you. So that's the main way I see temperament, is providing the parameters for what kids need. I don't see it as determining whether the child will have self-esteem, whether the child will be resilient, or those factors. I really do not as a causal force. I see it as a kind of context or setting. It's a context for development, just like the social support system of the parents is a context for development. But the critical aspects of development, in my opinion, occur in the interactions in relationships, the give and take between people. There are other points of view on this, and I recently read one by a good friend and colleague that there's this differential sensitivity hypothesis that's getting some popularity now. And that means that different children are more or less responsive to different kinds of environmental input. And some children are quite reactive to the environmental inputs. Other children are less reactive to the environmental inputs. That's a popular hypothesis these days. I remain unconvinced about it, but that's just me. I'm old and probably not going to change anymore.
Sure. And I guess maybe my last question, what did you learn about yourself writing this book?
Mm. Well, paradoxically, the first thing I'd say is not to take myself so seriously. And that kind of needed to happen because, to talk about things like my nail biting and enuresis, in the past would have been embarrassing or something. To talk about my responsibility for my first marriage failing, just own up to that and, just accept it as just, that's true. And so that's one thing. If I were going to say something positive about myself, I would say when I look at my history, I see quite a bit of persistence. I hung in there. I mean, I logged, not continuously, but I logged 30 years of therapy, I'd say. And, kept slugging away. And in my current relationship, which we've been married now 43 years, I worked long and hard, and it was not easy because relationships were not easy for me, that kind of relationship. I mean, I'm collegial and I can make friends, and can be humorous, and so I can have relationships. But the really vulnerable ones, where someone can see, deep inside you, those are scarier. I know that's true for everyone, but so I'd say I learned that, yeah, I have good persistence, and I really came to appreciate life, to tell you the honest truth. If you want to do a real aside, I'll tell you about a great book. It's called The Sacred Depths of Nature, and it's a woman who is a biologist, but it's how she found spirituality in nature. But the real key message of this book for me was, why is it that we have to die? What does death mean? And how do we deal with death? And she's got a great evolutionary answer to this. Single cell organisms aren't programmed to die. They just replicate and replicate and replicate. Now, if they happen to be living in a pond and they eat up everything that's there, they'll die, but they're not programmed to die. But single cell organisms have a real limitation. They have very limited mobility, if any. And so they're pretty much can only deal with the environment that they find themselves in. They can't operate on the environment very much. So multicellular organisms evolved to solve that problem. They could move, they could go from one environment to another, they could make use of various things, they could act on their environment. And that started the evolutionary process. And you get up to humans, and we have this self-reflective capacity and the capacity to anticipate the future. We have awareness of death. And so here's the choice you have. You can be a single cell organism, or you can die. Because from an evolutionary point of view, your body isn't that important. Your gametes are passed on or not. And once your gametes are passed on, you're not relevant to evolution anymore. So your body, your brain, your mind, you die. But I'll take that deal anytime. I found that book really reassuring. Life is some amazing thing. And even being able to be aware of our finiteness, the vastness of the universe, and the fact that we're going to die, even being aware of that, even being aware of the second law of thermodynamics, that eventually everything is going to just disperse and be back to just photons or less. That's okay.
It reminds me of the same kind of confidence and responsivity that you can kind of predict the outcome in this way, and that's not too bad.
No.
The two themes that you mentioned of both persistence and 40 years of research on child development, if that's not persistence, I don't know what is. Combined with acceptance, sounds like a pretty good thing to learn about. And of course, neither of them is entirely possible without the other, I imagine. So very good. Other things you'd like to say while we have a few folks with us? And by the way, if there's any questions, feel free to type them into the chat before we wrap up.
You should tell people we can turn them on to speak to.
And we can also turn you on to speak as well. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Well, I was thinking about probably the main intellectual piece of this book is that how to deal with the simultaneous fact of there being continuity and self-stabilization tendencies in development, with the fact that change is also possible. And how can both of those be true? How can it be true that your early influence is always with you and can never be erased? How can that be true? And how can you still change? How can that be true? And there were lots of examples in our study, and I try to put lots of examples in the book about that. And that's kind of, to me, the culminating uh, chapter in the book, although it's not the last chapter, the one about the process of change and how that can happen. That to me was the most interesting thing. You know, we started out just wanting to find out if there was any predictability in development, because shockingly, surprisingly, in the early 1970s when we started, it was widely believed that there was no continuity in development. And there were books written theoretically demonstrating that. Oh, hi, Naomi.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And I will say hello to June. Yeah. Now I got lost. That's a feature of age, but it's still well worth it.
Oh, Naomi is saying just like it was believed that there was no plasticity in the brain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Totally just like that.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And even like it was believed that your brain just developed by itself. And now we know, no, it develops, it's experience dependent and experience expectant. We know it develops in interaction with your relationships. We know that full well. Yeah, exactly. And that's, we started out just wanting to know, is there predictability? But man, by the time the kids were like 5 years old, even though, you know, we needed to follow them, we knew we were going to be able to predict on and on because the theory was so compellingly confirmed. But very soon, no, I have not. Very soon, we got interested in the question of change and how does it happen and the process. And that led us to a very new understanding of resilience. Just like Naomi's talking about the brain, resilience was thought of as something some kids just have, or some people have it. They're a resilient child, they have resilience. Well, no, that's not the way it works at all. Some kids have a foundation that allows them to capitalize on opportunities. And some kids have opportunities come their way. But if you don't have the foundation and you don't have the opportunities, there's nobody that's resilient. And there's a lot of work on that. Arnold Samaroff's study comes to mind the most, where he studied a variety of risk factors. And if you had a big enough pile of risk factors, they didn't find any kids who were doing well. You know, if it's all risk and no support, nobody's going to be okay. It just doesn't happen. That was part of what I was wanting to tell in this, David. I wanted to present, the reason I did it as a memoir and my own personal history, I wanted to present myself as somebody who could be called resilient, but who well understood I didn't get there on my own. I didn't just have difficult childhood. I had some support in my childhood, even from my parents, limited as they were. They gave me what they could. And I had teachers and others along the way. I had therapists. I have my wife. I have other supports. Yeah, I could be defined as resilient. You know, a window cleaner's kid who, you know, nobody in my family had ever had a college degree. Most of my mother's family hadn't had high school degrees. And my brother and I and my sister all have advanced degrees. So we're resilient. Well, yeah, we're resilient, but we had help being there.
Yeah,
And
that there's
that's the
this.
way it is.
Yeah, there's this story of the guidance counselor that said, "Oh, by the way, there's a scholarship available, and the deadline is tomorrow."
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah.
Oh my gosh, what a naive, uninformed, ignorant kid I was. Yeah, no, that was great. I'm glad you brought that example up because that did change my life. That just accident.
Yeah,
Yeah.
remarkable how these things happen. I just have to comment that a lot of my career has been spent with adolescents who've gotten themselves into all kinds of trouble with the law. And for many, many, many years, people in my field searched either for the best diagnosis or the most effective risk assessment measures. And that trend continues to this day. And it wasn't until the late 1990s that anybody thought maybe we should start looking at resilience in these kids or what kinds of factors protect from their, uh,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
so that's still very new.
Yeah.
So we have quite a ways to go. And Naomi, anything else to comment on since you have great things to say and great questions to ask
I wrote the
before?
title of that documentary down, so I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah, that looks really good. So, and in the absence of anything else, I think we're going to do this again, not 24 hours, but 25 hours
Yeah.
later, an hour later in the afternoon tomorrow. And it'd be great. Nothing that you can think of. Absolutely. Well, it's great having you, Naomi, and I hope to meet you at some point. And very good. So we'll get together tomorrow
All
and
right, David.
looking forward to it.
I'll see you then.
All right. Thanks, folks. We'll see you later. Bye-bye. Welcome, everybody. My name is David Prescott. I'm the editor of Safer Society Press, and Safer Society has proudly published this book, A Compelling Idea, How We Become the Persons We Are, and it's written by our guest, Alan Sroufe. And so it's great to have you here. We thought we would just chat about the book a little bit. And I also want to say that if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand or you can type it into the chat or the Q&A feature. It's entirely up to you. And while I'm at it, I'll just mention we also have closed captioning available as well. And so as for the book, well, Alan, you described it as a book. It's about a life, a career, and the history of an entire field. And as Dan Siegel said, it's a magnificent combination of memoir and scientific autobiography. I'm interested, what motivated you to write it? And can you give us a quick overview of the book itself?
Well, it is in many ways a story, actually, three stories, I suppose. It's the story of our Minnesota research project where we followed some 180 children born into poverty from just before they were born until they're now in their 40s. And a large number of graduate students and staff worked on this project over the years. Many things were discovered. And we've documented findings from this study in countless journal articles and a couple of previous books. But most of that writing was technical and it's spread all over the place, hard to find. So partly this book is a readable story of this project, what the initial questions were, how those questions and answers led to new questions and so forth. But it also is a story of the field because our project began just when psychology was poised for a revolution in how we understand development. Prior to the mid 1970s, psychology was pretty much in the embrace of behaviorism, which had its strong points. It was very useful, but not a very good account of development. And there were many problems with behaviorism vis-a-vis development. Um, Very little about why behaviors emerge in the repertoire when they do and how development builds on itself. Very little in behaviorism about that. So along came attachment theory and said there's a very different way of looking at development uh, with a key role for relationships. Before this time, psychology was very much an individual psychology, very little study of relationships in developmental psychology or psychology in general. Even social psychology was primarily concerned with understanding groups or how groups affected individuals, but not about relationships per se. That's, of course, all changed now, and in large part because of attachment theory. So, partly this book also was intended to be the story of how the field changed, how attachment theory really created a revolution in developmental psychology. And it did. It was a thoroughgoing revolution. Looking back, it's hard for current students to understand how we might have thought, say in 1970, that there was no consistency in personality, there was no stability in personality, that what happened to you in early experience had no lasting significance. But all these kinds of things were considered established findings at the time. And starting then, massive changes in the field. And then the third thing, being a person that did this work for all these years and then retired and had a chance to think a lot, I also wanted to tell the story of my own involvement in this work, how my own history led me to be interested in this work, and how this work influenced my own life trajectory. So it is 3 stories, and it was totally fun to write, David, totally fun.
Yeah, and indeed, and obviously, I have something of a vested interest in it, working for the publisher as I do. But it is a really easy read. I absolutely noticed that from one draft into the next. I guess I'm interested in for you. What were some of the key personal turning points that made so much of this happen?
Oh boy. uh, well, developmentalists, tend to want to go back to the beginning. Uh, so I'll do the early part quickly. I I always knew I had certain difficulties as a child, and I had some inkling of that my family was dysfunctional in some ways. But of course, when you're inside of it, it's the family you know. But that's what piqued my interest in psychology. That's what got me to study psychology in college and to want to go to graduate school. I wanted to understand why my parents had the problems they did, and I wanted to understand why I had the problems I did. And I was not, I did well in school, but I wasn't well educated because I was a fairly anxious person and stuff didn't stick in my brain so well early on. But in college, it started to take hold. And I know you know the story of I got to college because uh, I got a note from a counselor when I was a senior in high school to report to the counselor's office, and went there with trepidation only to find out that she called me in to tell me there was a scholarship test being offered the next day for the last time, and that I should take the test, which I did. And it was a marvelous program. It gave me 4 years of uh, tuition and board at any college in the state of California, which would have included Berkeley, Stanford, any college. I wound up going to a very small college because I was not prepared to go to a major university at that time. And there I had good encounters with psychologists and with students who had intellectual orientation. I got to work on research projects even beginning my first year because they had no graduate students. And so the psychology professors were keen on having undergraduates work with them. And that set me up to go to graduate school. And then, just Stephen Gould has this marvelous discussion in his book, Wonderful Life, where he talks about contingencies and how chance events completely alter trajectories of history. And that was certainly true for me. Going to college was almost an accident. Getting into the graduate school I did was kind of an accident, and running into the professors I did there, who wound up sending me out to San Francisco to do my clinical internship. And that's where I met people who were thinking psychodynamically for the first time in my life. Came to appreciate that maybe there was such a thing as unconscious motivation. And then I encountered, the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth as a young faculty member. I'll perhaps tell more anecdotes about that as we go along, but that story is getting long. I'll just say I stumbled into this, but I'll tell you, I knew, here I was, this staunchly trained behaviorist. I knew behaviorism inside and out. My doctoral dissertation was training people using operant conditioning to control their heart rates. And, that was where I was going. And then I encountered attachment theory, and I just knew this was right. And, Everett Waters and I teamed up at his initiative and did a couple of studies. And we knew so early, first, that these relationships were stable. Here's the interesting thing, David. The behavior of babies is not very stable for obvious reasons. They're developing so fast. So if you measure something like how frequency does a baby smile or laugh or approach his mother or cry in a laboratory assessment, so you do that for a half an hour, and then look at him 6 months later, there's no correlation. So baby's behavior is unstable, and yet these relationships were stable. The relationships they have with their caregiver. The behavior changed. So when the baby was 12 months old, perhaps when it was upset by the separation, when mom came back, it crawled over there and wanted to be picked up and hugged for a couple of minutes. When it was 18 months old, mom comes in, it shows her a toy and vocalizes and greets and smiles at her. The behaviors are totally different, but it means the same thing. My haven of safety has returned. I am more comfortable when this person is with me. So the relationships were stable. And then we wound up showing in the first few years of our studies that from looking at the mother and baby in the strange situation, you could predict both the behavior of the mother and the child in a different situation later. And ultimately that you could predict the behavior of the child even when the mother wasn't there. All things that behaviorism would have found quite challenging to explain. So,
Yeah, no question. As you're telling this story, it's hard not to reflect on how so much of human existence has noise in the system. And had it not for you going to the guidance office on just that day, if you hadn't been in school that particular day, your life could have turned out entirely different. And so your own personal development was subjected to so many random events. And at the same time, you were able to scientifically find that in development, which was predictable. From a research standpoint, was that must have been very difficult to sort through. Was there any scientific perspective you can offer on this?
well, you're raising the most interesting question. How is it? And you haven't even mentioned developmental change. You're
Yeah.
mentioning contingent chance events, which they're a plethora. And you're absolutely right. I would have never worked in the attachment field as a researcher if that counselor hadn't told me to take that test. I might have had a good life. I would, would hope so. And I might have done some interesting things, but I wouldn't have done that. And you could list off 10 or 20 or 100 things. If Everett Waters hadn't walked into my office and said, say, I want to learn this psychophysiology stuff you're doing, and I've learned how to do these attachment assessments. What if we combine those and do some studies? I was doing interesting work at the time about babies' emotional development, but not about attachment. And if Everett hadn't come to graduate school at Minnesota, I would have probably never studied attachment. Millions of things like that. So how can there be any continuity? Well, the answer is there isn't continuity in specific behavioral manifestations. So the predictability that we can do, for example, disorganized attachment in infancy is the strongest predictor we can find of psychopathology in early adulthood. Because it's very, very difficult to predict who's going to have psychopathology when an infant is 12 months old. Now, of course, it is not all or even most babies who have disorganized attachment as infants who show psychopathology. So that's where the noise comes in. And the kind of pathology that an infant is going to show can be quite varied when they grow up. Risk studies sort of knew that for a long time. With another really strong predictor is what is called early persistent conduct problems. Kids that show a pattern of oppositional defiant disorder as preschoolers and then conduct problems in, say, early elementary school. By third grade, studies have shown highly predictable that those individuals will have problems as adults. But what kind of problem? Some of them have alcohol and drug problems. Some have problems in criminology. There's a host of problems. You can't, from disorganized attachment or from a history of conduct problems to up to third grade, predict exactly what problems people will have. Or even, it's hard to predict which ones won't have problems later. But with group data, you can start getting a handle on this stuff. If you don't think your predictions will be point predictions. One more example. There was some controversy for a while about the lasting impact of child abuse. Early on, I mean, there's another thing, mid-1970s, the literature suggested child abuse basically didn't have lasting effects. That, you know, now that looks idiotic in retrospect.
Yes.
But what were they trying to find? One thing they did was measure IQ, and they found that the IQs of abused kids weren't notably different from the IQs of non-abused kids when you took into account social class. But is IQ the only possible outcome? Another thing was, you may or may not, you would likely know this, the vast majority of parents who were abused as children do not abuse their own children. And so people concluded from that, well, child abuse isn't that big of a deal. But now let's look at a family of outcomes. Let's look at problems of drug and alcohol abuse. Let's look at whether they abuse. Let's look at depression and social isolation. Let's look at a family of outcomes. Now you start finding maltreatment is clearly one of the most powerful risk factors there is. And, you know, we were able to do lots of demonstrations in our study of this, of those I want to call them facts now, but let's say propositions. We could find that, yes, it's predictable because it was a new way of thinking about prediction, about thinking about how would there be continuity within change and what kinds of things would predict to what. You know, we had this fascinating finding that some of our predictions to adolescents from infant attachment were as strong or stronger than our predictions to preschool or middle childhood. And that's unusual because usually the more time goes by, the more of these random factors could enter in. And pretty often you find that the closer your outcome variable, the better your predictions. And I agree with that. That's a general truism, but it's not always true. And it depends in part on the kinds of things you're measuring. And for example, we measured adolescents' capacity for vulnerability, because this, it's a very vulnerable time, and the capacity to open yourself up, to trust another person, to move toward intimacy, to reveal your inner feelings, that's a challenging capacity to come by. Now, why did infant attachment predict that so well? Well, infant attachment is all about trust. It's the core of learning that other people will be there for me, that I am a worthy person. And so in retrospect, that's no big surprise that we could predict that well. There are other things that in preschool or middle childhood were really strong outcome variables. Emotion regulation, and especially, I won't say the name of this construct because it has different names and it could be misinterpreted, so I'll just describe it. The capacity to adjust your behavior to fit circumstances. So you're out on the playground, you can run around, jump and shout, go for it. Now you're back in the classroom and it's story time. You need to sit quietly and listen and not disrupt others. It's not just one of those or the other, it's the capacity to adjust. Man, we predicted that strongly from attachment, because attachment is emotion regulation. It's training in regulation. So, long answer again, I give long answers. I think I told you this, Annika, before. I heard a dean say once that after a year of being dean, he learned to say in 20 minutes what he used to be able to say in 5.
Nice.
It's generally true of professors. I could have given a more succinct answer, but that's the honest, true answer. It's a different way of looking at things. It is kind of a paradox. But heck, physicists deal with particles being both waves and things being, photons are both waves and particles. And they deal with, if you measure a position of a particle, you can't tell its velocity. If you measure the velocity, you can't. So why is this worse? There is simultaneously continuity and coherence. And that's the main term. There is coherence in development despite change. And even when predictions fail, it's still for coherent reasons. So kids who are doing better than we thought they would, we find definable reasons that account for that. And when kids are doing worse than we thought, we find reasons in the intervening years for them that knocked them off. And we can even predict who's more likely to get back up again, or among children doing well, we can still know who's more vulnerable, and then follow them later and see stressors come in and see who gets knocked off. At any point in time, and it's the same thing physicists would say, at any point in time, there's a lot of stuff going around, and a lot of stuff is just potential that you can't exactly see right now. But development is coherent, so you will see it if you keep looking.
It's just a remarkable unfolding of events. As you were talking, I was thinking about some families that I've worked with where each of the kids seem to follow a different developmental trajectory. Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of a commonly observed phenomenon that a family has 3 kids, 2 of them end up in trouble, and a third seems to be utterly resilient despite all of the odds, and it can sometimes be inexplicable
Mhm.
and how these things turn out. In the time that we do have, and having sat in on a lot of the workshops at this conference, I guess I just wonder, what are some of the immediate take-home points for people who are working in the field? What is, what should teachers know, for example, or parents?
Yeah, well, the main lesson from our work is how important both parents and teachers are. Um, there's a guy who's at this conference who worked on our project, whose name is Robert Pianta, who has been applying attachment theory and the findings from our work to classroom teaching. And what he does is look at the impact of simply training teachers in to provide secure-based behavior for children, to be sensitive and responsive to the emotional needs of the children, to be a resource for the children, an emotional resource for the children. He doesn't work with the children, he works with the teachers on how to be a secure-based provider for children, and then looks at the impact on the behavior problems of the children and finds remarkable effects by doing that. So, two things there. Number one, how important those relationships are. Given that this study showed not just that there was continuity, but that there was change, and that change was possible at a whole variety of ages and stages, it's important for teachers to know that what they're doing at any age they're working with children is of great importance. And it would be good for teachers to have more training in attachment and in understanding how to provide a secure base for children, that it will help. The other thing, I know I've told you this before, but it's also important for teachers and parents and others, anyone who deals with a child, to keep in mind that while if a child's problems are longstanding, they're not going to be easily changed. But nonetheless, what you are doing is providing a platform, even if you don't see the change, an island of security for that child, so that the next person that encounters them with a motive of helping them will have something to build on. I think that's critically important to know. It would be so easy for teachers to be discouraged when you have multi-problem children in your classrooms. Your class is too filled with multi-problem children, and it'd be easy for teachers. There was a program on NPR just a few days ago talking with teachers who had left the field and why they had left. And the main answer was the task was overwhelming and they felt too little support. And I understand. It wasn't that they didn't like the children. It wasn't that they didn't like teaching. It wasn't they got in there and thought, oh, I guess this teaching isn't what I like. They need more support and more help, and they need help understanding that even though this kid who came into your class having problems and left your class at the end of the year having problems, that doesn't mean you did not help that child. I believe that 100%.
As do I, obviously. And I just also want to say, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter them right into the chat or raise your hand or
Just
write
say
something into
hello,
the Q&A. I'm sorry.
or just say hello.
Or just say hello. Yes. Right. At least stop in and say hi, as I like to say. Um, as you were talking, I was thinking at the very least, maybe the message is, let's just imagine that at worst, you're noise in the system. At the very least, you can be the secure base of noise in the system, or you can be that advantageous noise in the system.
Yeah, an example. I mean, when when Bowlby wrote or spoke about how change happens in therapy, it's very much the same thing. And he, in a sense, what he was talking about is that what you're doing when you encounter a child who's struggling is you're attempting to disconfirm his view of how the world works, because he has a certain view of the world and his place in it. And if it's a troubled child, that view of the world includes, I can't much expect things from myself or from people. People aren't going to be very interested in my needs or very helpful. And I'm not very worthy of getting anything from them anyway. And it's so easy for children to confirm those models because, you smash another little kid over the head with a fire truck. The teacher, takes you and puts you in timeout. You got rejected again for your behavior. That's the way the world works. Now, teachers have a tricky problem there. You can't ignore that behavior, but at the same time, you don't want to give him another example of my behavior always leads to rejection. So if we had the proper resources for our teachers, there'd be at least one other teacher in that classroom so that one teacher or other could go with that child to timeout. It's not fun and games, but it's also not rejection and isolation. It's you're not ready right now to be in the classroom. We can't have you hitting other children with fire trucks. So you and I are going to stay here for a while until you're ready, settled and ready to be back in the classroom. And that sounds so simple, but that's what we're doing. And if you've been, and I saw our nursery school teachers, they were so good. I saw these volatile children and I saw our teachers be so patient with them and caring and supportive. And it matters. It matters even if the child is still troubled at the end of your class. You show them an example, and it's an example that didn't fit in to the way they looked at the world. And if they get enough of those examples, they'll change their view of the world, which is what therapy is, helping people change their view of the world.
Excellent. Absolutely. And I see we did get a question about the process of mentoring. There aren't enough mentors that work with kids these days. And the question is, could you please say something to advise and or encourage the people that are mentoring at-risk kids? A group of people very close to my heart, very special people in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is what we're talking about right now. What a service to children, especially I'm assuming that this is an ongoing one-on-one relationship that's being talked about. That's far and away the best way to help a child and to disconfirm their prior models of how the world works. It will, if you're mentoring a child, a multi-problem child, you will be tested. They have the belief, remember, that you will reject them. If not now, then soon. If not soon, then later. And if you can be a steadfast present with that child, you're doing a world of service to them. Now, as far as there aren't enough mentors, we really need to change our society priority. First of all, we've got a gazillion seniors out there that could be organized and motivated to be mentors. I know a lot of seniors that are mentors, but I know a lot more that could be. And we don't have a sufficient structure and program and orientation as a society to do what's needed right now. So I appreciate that question, and if the person asking it is a mentor, you have my praise.
Yeah.
It's a great thing.
And to underline something that you just said, I know from my own experience, working with kids with disorganized attachment styles or just plain lots of behavioral issues. These kids very often interact with mentors and teachers and other care providers in a way that seems to invite the same kind of abuse or neglect that they've experienced in the past. And I think maybe for many of the reasons that you've just said, I'm expecting this from you, if not now, then in the very near future,
Mhm.
et cetera. Does what I just said fit with your research and experience?
Yeah, completely. Um, yeah, gosh, I'm thinking of several anecdotes. Well, one that's in the book, and I don't remember what name I made up for this child in the book right at the moment. So I just won't make up a name at all and just say one of the children in our study, very poignant story, terrible abusive history. I mean, and chaotic. Any risk factor you want to name, it was there. And so she comes into our preschool and she's very volatile, also very bright child, but very volatile, emotional outburst, just really could hardly contain herself. And yet this, our main, we had a primary male and a primary female teacher in this preschool, and plus several other teachers. I mean, we had staff like you could dream about. And the primary female teacher really took a liking to her. And boy, she was patient with her. My gosh, she just like enveloped her with caring. And so partway through the term, the little girl came in and said, I had a dream about you, about the teacher. And the teacher asked her, well, what was that? And that you threw me against a wall. Now there you can see some of what's happening. That the teacher, of course, told her I would never do that. And the little girl asked, why not? That required explanation. So they had a little conversation about that. But you can see that what was happening as this teacher was breaking down the defenses of this child. It wasn't her goal. She was just loving the kid. I mean, she didn't have a 10-point strategy of how do I break down the defenses of this little girl. She just was a nurturant person and she was caring for her. So what happened as the kid starts getting close, something rises up inside of her and says, this is dangerous. And that's what her dream is about. Her dream says, this is what can happen if you let yourself get close to this teacher. But she's a good case in point of someone where she still was troubled at the end of preschool, but she made a lot of headway. And what that teacher did for her, I am absolutely confident is still part of her psyche today. And I say that not, I haven't had any awareness of this person as an individual for the last 15 or 20 years. I only know our group data. I don't know specifically how she's doing. But what I would say to you is whether she is doing well or not, what that teacher did for her is part of her. And it's also, it's, when we, it was predictable that the children that did unprovoked aggression in the preschool, that behavior was predictable from their attachment history. It was only certain kinds of anxiously attached kids that would do unprovoked aggression. So it was predictable that they would do what they did in preschool. And it was predictable that at times that would ring teachers' bells. I remember one time, I don't even know if I put this story in the book. Is kind of reveals something I wish I'd been a stronger person. But I saw this kid, that hitting a kid over the head with a fire truck thing. The reason that comes to my mind all the time is I witnessed this. And I was at the preschool every day. I couldn't be a source of data, but I was an observer, and sometimes I was in the classroom. And I had a hard time not going and grabbing that kid when he did that. And I had to do some real soul searching, because I know full well what his experience is and was. And I know what that was his way of trying to keep his world ordered, because he lived in a hostile world in his head. And in a world where the proposition is when one person is vulnerable, the other attacks. That was the world he lived in. So he saw this vulnerable little girl, really emotionally disturbed, shy, internalizing little girl, hardly could function. Vulnerability just oozed out of her. That was a trigger for him, so to speak. But the main point here is, my gosh, what that did to me. So now put yourself in a position of being a teacher that doesn't necessarily know the kid's history, or hasn't had umpteen decades of therapy or whatever. And, it's amazing. And it's different kids. Like the teacher I was telling you who was so nurturing, that wouldn't have rung her bell. But the male teacher and me, it did. And then there are other kids who had problems that didn't bother me at all. The hyper little kids that run around and scream and shout, that didn't bother me. I just say, oh, come on, let's cool it. But other people just couldn't stand that. I couldn't stand the unprovoked aggression. It scared me. And anyone who reads the book will know why that was the case.
Exactly. I just have to comment on that girl with the dream and the little inkling of vulnerability it took for her to even tell the teacher that.
Yeah. It was a major step.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an act of bravery.
Yeah. Resilience in its finest form, no question.
Yeah. Where she got that, well, that's an interesting question in its own right. One thing we came to know from studying these parents carefully, I personally did not see a parent that did not love their children. And that includes the roughly 30% of our sample that we considered maltreating. And that includes the 10% that were physically maltreating. They love their children. They just had their own histories and their own circumstances that really compromised how that could ever be revealed, or whether it could. And I think, even in troubled kids, that's our hope, that there's been some germs, seeds of affection and caring that they have experienced in the midst of the trauma and other stuff. And we can access that. We can go back and contact that and pull it forward. And I believe in that case of that little girl. And I believe that now when she left our preschool, and then actually, in point of fact, she wound up having individual therapy for a number of years in childhood, and I know her therapist who also worked on our project. And I think that was a really fortunate thing for her. It had nothing to do with our study, because this was a graduate student who finished graduate school, became a clinician, and as a clinician saw this child not because she was a member of our study, but as another client at the clinic. And obviously, we could never tell that clinician any ongoing data from the study, what we were finding out. We couldn't do that, and reasonably so. Nor could that clinician tell us anything about her therapy sessions or anything. But I can put two and two together and say that was a good break for that kid.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And going back to the question about mentors and mentorship, your description of with the fire truck incident really, pushed my buttons and the teacher's buttons. It wouldn't have pushed the other teachers' buttons. Makes me think that makes me reflect on how all of the mentors that may be watching this or hearing about this are all individual people, and we never know what kind of thing might just rub us the wrong way in our day-to-day interactions.
Mhm.
But I guess the moral of the story is to always be focused on remaining that secure base.
Someday you might try to convince Mary Dozier to do a webinar with you, David,
Ah,
who who does foster parent research, among other things,
oh,
and probably has learned more than anybody else about how people can fit with other people and how to help foster parents fit with the particular child they're struggling with.
well, I will absolutely look her up.
She is at the conference, I have no doubt. I think she's even she might be one of the keynote speakers or one of the meet the experts, but she's really solid.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a name that rings a bell. I'm not entirely sure why, but we'll absolutely look her up.
But
Interested in any other questions?
she gave a very nice endorsement of the book.
Oh, okay. Very good. That must be it. Yeah. So great. Well, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to just say if you have a question you would like to ask in the chat Q&A, or just raise your hand and we can unmute you. Sort of going once, twice, three times before we wrap up. I know we've actually gone over time, but I just want to extend the invitation to anybody, especially given the mentorship question and a topic that I think is close to the hearts of just about anybody that would read your book, Ellen. So, any other words for the greater good? Anything that I haven't asked in our interviews that I should have?
I think we're good, David.
Yeah. Very good. Well, Alan Sroufe, thank you so much for joining us again, folks. Author of A Compelling Idea: How We Become the Persons That We Are, published by Safer Society Press. It's a magnificent read and just a wonderful accomplishment. So, thanks for joining us today, and look forward to speaking with you again.
Yep, my pleasure, David.
All
Have
right.
a good one.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.